Hello, I'm Jim Paxson. Whether it's working to save an endangered species or assisting an injured golden eagle to recover from a nasty wreck, Arizona Game and Fish, along with its partner agencies, is on the front line of wildlife conservation. Those stories and more coming up right now on Arizona Wildlife Views.
Arizona Wildlife Views is brought to you by the sale of hunting and fishing licenses and the Heritage Fund, lottery dollars working for wildlife. Some projects made possible by the Sport Fish and Wildlife Restoration Fund.
Welcome to our show. We begin today with a story about the Sonoran pronghorn in southwestern Arizona, where a little more than a decade ago there were only 21 animals left in the United States. But that was before this ambitious recovery program began.
The sunrise is spectacular on this December morning in southwestern Arizona. But even at this early hour, dozens of biologists, veterinarians, and handlers are gearing up to help a very endangered species along its road to recovery.
You guys will go with that animal wherever it goes. So you'll follow the animal to the trailer, you'll follow it out to the pen, make sure everything and if you don't have it complete, just say wait to everybody.
The species in question is the Sonoran pronghorn. It's a smaller, distinct subspecies of the American pronghorn, and today about 30 of the animals will make the transition from captivity to being released into the wild.
We're moving pronghorn from the Sonoran pronghorn captive breeding facility in Ajo to a new area. It's going to be the third population of Sonoran pronghorn that we hope to establish in Arizona. And we're very excited about this because there's a couple million acres of habitat that they can expand into, and hopefully the population will grow.
The population needs to continue to grow if it's going to survive. The Sonoran pronghorn was first put on the endangered species list in 1967. But when the devastating drought of 2002 hit this area, its numbers crashed to only 21 animals. That's when state and federal wildlife agencies built this square-mile enclosure and began a captive breeding program to try to save the species. One by one, the animals that have been designated for transport are singled out and captured with a net. The vets and handlers then work quickly to help reduce stress on the high-strung pronghorn.
Ear tagger? Ear tag.
And what can seem chaotic
Where's my stretchers?
is actually a well-orchestrated operation made up of Arizona Game and Fish, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. military, and other wildlife agencies all working together to give these animals the best chance of survival.
Basically, we're giving them all the vaccines they need, rabies, blue tongue, and Clostridium infections. We're giving them antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, pain medication, and a dewormer as well. And again, just trying to stabilize them in this initial handling phase until we can get them in the trailer where once they're in the dark and calm and with their friends, they're happy again.
The trailers are new and specially designed to help the nervous pronghorn handle being transported. They're air-conditioned, padded, and dark.
On an annual basis, we have animals that are basically in excess of what we want in the pen, so we remove them and take them to where we think they'll do the most good in the wild. Because our objective is not to have captive animals in a pen, but to take the excess animals and release them into the wild, hopefully, creating new populations along the way.
For several weeks prior to the capture, the pronghorn have been fed in these round pens called bomas, able to come and go as they please. The only thing different today is that someone closed the gate. They are hoping to capture and move 16 female and 14 male pronghorn. A few extras that were basically in the wrong place at the wrong time have their health assessed and then are released back into the large recovery pen.
Well, they're fed here every day, so they're in great shape coming out of the pen. They're fed not only an alfalfa supplement, they have natural desert to eat on, and they're fed a pelleted ration so they can get all the groceries and minerals and vitamins they need. We're just helping them get a little farther down the road.
Before noon, the trailers pull out of the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge and head to their new location. It's a large holding pen on the Barry M. Goldwater Range north of Ajo. Sonoran pronghorn are the fastest land animal in North America and can clock speeds up to 60 miles per hour. But with all the people and cameras, these pronghorns seem a little hesitant about their new home. They will stay in this large pen for a few weeks to acclimate to the conditions. Then the fence will come down and they'll be free to go.
So the populations may go up or down, but by spreading our pronghorn populations out, we're hopefully avoiding another disaster like we experienced in 2002, where it didn't rain and the one population that we had nearly went extinct.
Sonoran pronghorn are found in only 2 places in the world, northern Mexico and southwestern Arizona. Early settlers to this area called them prairie ghosts because their coloring and lightning speed made them seem to disappear into the landscape. Fortunately, thanks to the work of a lot of people willing to put in the time and effort, their numbers in the wild have risen from a low of 21 to about 300 animals today, making it unlikely the Sonoran pronghorn will disappear from this landscape anytime soon. This golden eagle is one lucky bird. Thanks to the quick reactions of a lot of people, he's about to be released back into the wild after a death-defying collision with a semi-tractor trailer on Interstate 40.
It cracked open the windshield, but there wasn't a gaping hole, but it caved it in. It made a big indent in that windshield, like a big rock would. The damage to that windshield was pretty intense.
When DPS officers arrived on the scene, they didn't have much hope for the eagle's chances.
It's dead. It's like a grape. It's gone, and then it's standing there. It's still alive. When I arrived on scene, you can see the bird kind of out of it, standing in the emergency lane, just about 3 feet from traffic. For lack of a better term, it was like a drunk. It was just sitting there circling, just teetering. It wasn't aware of what was happening. Cars would go by and it wasn't aware of anything. And then all of a sudden its head just snaps. And then it looked at everything and it made eye contact, and you can tell it was pretty upset.
Rescuing wildlife isn't a typical day on the job for DPS.
Not like that. We deal with cows and horses and goats and stuff out on the interstate, but nothing like this, nothing that could, it was angry and it didn't want anything to do with us. So.
Lucky for it, the DPS officers didn't care. They captured the injured bird and contacted Arizona Game and Fish, which placed it into the care of wildlife rehabilitators at Liberty Wildlife in Phoenix. Now, after months of rehabilitation, they're returning it to its home in the wild.
Like there like an eagle. Hang on a minute, hang on. Relax, relax.
When this bird first came, it was very traumatized and it was very lethargic and down. We took x-rays. Maybe there was a crack in the clavicle, which would be the wishbone, but it wasn't displaced.
Amazingly, other than having its bell rung really hard, the bird wasn't seriously injured.
Thought it was going to have severe internal injuries and fractures, but nothing was broken.
The eagle was hit almost 3 months ago, and after some proper care at Liberty Wildlife, it's finally ready to go home.
His rehab's gone very well. He's been one of our easier cases in the sense that there's been less hands-on that's needed to be done with him. It's just been more of a, R&R rest and making sure that he's eating right and getting the right care and getting the exercise that he needs to build up the strength that's needed before release. Yeah, he's ready to go.
So on a hill near Seligman, Arizona, not far from where this majestic golden eagle was injured, many of the people responsible for his rescue and recovery gathered to watch his return to the wild.
Okay, are we ready?
Yeah, 1, 3.
Ready, Kenny?
1, 2, 3.
Perfect.
As the bird disappeared into the distance, the DPS officers who helped rescue it were glad they had the opportunity to protect and conserve one very lucky golden eagle.
It was pretty awesome to be able to see that take off and the power and the majesty of that bird.
This is the Phoenix Zoo most of us are familiar with, but this too is the zoo. It's all part of the Phoenix Zoo's commitment to conservation, which started soon after it opened its doors in 1962. That's when the zoo was asked to join Operation Oryx by starting a breeding program for the Arabian oryx, an endangered antelope from the Middle East.
We were actually the holders of the world's herd for a number of years, and we were involved in breeding them up so that they could get distributed to other zoos, and then ultimately they were reintroduced back into the wild in 1982.
Today, the zoo's conservation efforts are heavily focused on at-risk species that are native to Arizona, like the endangered black-footed ferret and the threatened Chiricahua leopard frog. Working with the Arizona Game and Fish Department, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and other conservation partners, the zoo successfully raises frogs and ferrets that are released into their native Arizona habitats.
He's ready to go in his burrow.
And really our goal is to actually start to replenish the population or augment the wild population so that they don't get listed or that they can be removed from the endangered species list. Essentially, we want to go out of business eventually. We hope that that happens soon, but we don't want it to happen too soon.
There's way too much work to do and far too many local species in dire need of help, victims of habitat loss, disease, and competition with non-native predators. They include the Mount Graham red squirrel, the spring snail, and the narrow-headed garter snake. Each one of these species presents a unique set of challenges for researchers at the zoo's Conservation and Science Center.
You go into these, what I call little puzzles and challenges, you're not sure if you're going to have success. The stressful part about it is in many cases, like with the Mount Graham red squirrel, there's only about 250 of them out there, and it's a worry if something goes wrong.
But the Phoenix Zoo has an excellent track record when it comes to working with imperiled species. That's why in 2011, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service collected 4 Mount Graham red squirrels and delivered them to the zoo's conservation center.
I came up here at that time and was able to capture 2 males and 2 females that I brought to the Phoenix Zoo just sort of like as a hedge, basically.
It was an emergency action to protect the squirrel from imminent wildfire and possible extinction.
It was a very dry year, so we were really concerned that there was the potential for this mountain to burn and that we would lose, all the habitat for the squirrel.
Mount Graham red squirrels are only found in the Pinaleño Mountains of southeastern Arizona, where the highest peak, Mount Graham, rises from the desert floor to an elevation of more than 10,700 feet. So making them feel at home in Phoenix isn't easy. They're kept in a temperature-controlled building that's cooled to a constant 65 degrees.
But in our setting, we can't quite get the temperature as cold as it is in Mount Graham. In this setting, we have to compensate a little bit by reducing their energy intake and monitoring their diet.
It took some time to figure out how to keep the squirrels alive and at a healthy weight. Now the zoo is developing a pilot breeding program. It's a complex puzzle because Mount Graham red squirrels are solitary and very territorial animals. Plus, the females are receptive to breeding for only about 4 to 8 hours on just one day each year.
Our challenge is we don't know which day of the year that is, and we don't know which 4-hour window we have to put them together. Because they're territorial, if we do it at the wrong time, they can hurt each other or seriously injure themselves.
Today, this female squirrel is meeting a new man who's moving in next door. By confining male squirrels to their nest boxes, it's easy to switch them from one enclosure to the other. Then it's a matter of opening some doors to see if the squirrels will act aggressively or amorously.
And we use different tools. We're looking at behavior, interactions that suggest that they're going to be compatible. And we also use some science, which is physiology. We look to see whether or not they're in an estrus, something called fecal steroid analysis.
By monitoring hormone levels, they try to predict when the squirrels will be ready to mate. But most of the work is done through careful observation. The squirrels are under video surveillance 24/7, and those videos are scrutinized for any change in behavior that offers a clue about reproductive readiness.
So what I'm doing is I'm recording feeding behavior and re-watching recorded feeding times with 2 of our squirrels.
If during this arranged rendezvous it looks like the squirrels are in the mood for love, that final barrier between them can be removed. Unfortunately, this introduction did not lead to a love connection, so the search for a breakthrough continues.
Got one right there.
These puzzles come in all shapes and sizes. The spring snail is currently the tiniest.
I counted 116 today on the full count. I guess there's between 175 and 200 snails in here.
It may look like an insignificant little creature, but don't let its size fool you.
If these species are present in a water system, that's a really good sign.
Spring snails are hugely important to aquatic ecosystems. They keep the water clean by eating algae and all sorts of organic pollutants. Now, they only live for about a year, so researchers don't have much time to work with a given population.
Just trying to get a better look at its shell whorls to try to determine an exact age class of it.
There are about a dozen spring snail species in Arizona, and none is doing very well. The three-forked spring snail is listed as an endangered species. In 2008 and 2009, the zoo was not able to get them to reproduce in the lab. Then in 2010, it switched to a surrogate species, the page spring snail, which is found in Arizona's Verde Valley.
Yep, so there's a page spring snail right there.
Because we were working with a less endangered species, we had an opportunity to experiment, if you will, or try different things to see if they were working.
After experimenting with water chemistry and methods that give the snails a better chance to find each other during breeding season, the zoo is seeing positive results.
We've got reproduction, but we don't seem to have thousands of spring snails. So we think there's some things we haven't quite figured out, but the population is maintaining itself now. We'd like it to grow.
That alone is a victory, because at the start of this project, nobody knew if it was even possible to keep spring snails alive outside of their natural habitat. On a side note, the page spring snail was a candidate for federal protection in 2015, but thanks to years of conservation and habitat restoration by Game and Fish, the zoo, and other federal and private partners, listing was not necessary.
So that's actually really big news.
This is a snake that we haven't been able to find for a couple days out here. I have to remark her, but...
It was a different story for the narrow-headed garter snake.
So we remark them with nail polish just to differentiate them at a quick glance.
In 2014, it was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act.
They're also all equipped with a chip So we have a reader that we can scan it.
It's a fish-eating snake that's found in New Mexico and Arizona, especially in Oak Creek Canyon.
This is basically a little slice of their habitat that they would be living in. So these guys, they do all their hunting on their own. You know, they get to move about freely. They're just checked on twice a day for health purposes.
Folks at U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Arizona Game and Fish approached us because they were seeing a decline in the numbers of narrow-headed garter snake in the wild, and they feared that they were going to be listed as endangered. And they asked if we could start to work out the mechanics of managing them outside of their natural habitat to see if we could get them to reproduce.
The narrow-headed garter snake has been kept in managed settings before, but has never reproduced, which we were able to do that, and that's really exciting.
The zoo acquired 7 narrow-headed garter snakes in 2007. A few years later, they reached sexual maturity and the first breeding attempt was observed, but no offspring were produced. After 3 more years of documented breeding with no offspring, the zoo finally had success in 2014.
This is Rhiannon. She's the one who gave birth to our neonates last July. So she is the mother of all of these little guys in here.
The zoo tried something new that year during the winter months when snakes go into brumation, a state of low activity similar to hibernation.
People will brumate them in a refrigerator, which is what we were doing. But we think that us having our hands on them and doing that forced brumating was maybe impacting our success in reproduction. So we came up with the idea to have them out here and let them brumate on their own.
The Conservation Center built this brumation chamber, a cold, dark place where the snakes could go to brumate.
And sure enough, our female Rhiannon, she chose this brumation chamber, and we had success that year. So
these are the offspring of our adult female narrow-headed garter snake. So they're just a little bit over a year old.
From a litter or clutch of 20 neonates, 18 snakes survived.
So what we do is we take periodic weights and measurements, so we have a metric to see how fast they grow, at what point do they reach adult size, and then we do behavioral observations as to see when they'll reach sexual maturity.
The male offspring are cared for in this lab, while the females live outside in this temperature-controlled enclosure.
This is Manzanita, so he's one of our breeding males. You can see
he's here because he's not related to any of the other snakes, but hopefully he'll father some in the near future. If he does, that could mean the researchers have finally solved another complicated puzzle. But the true test of success is raising animals that can be successfully returned to the wild.
Some things we can't do that have been historically done for managing animals that are going to remain, in a zoo setting. For example, feeding an animal at the same time every day. We can't do that with the animals we work with here because that would inherently affect their ability to survive if they're becoming accustomed to getting food at a predictable time, or having their food presented to them in a way that they don't have to open it up like a pine cone, which is Mount Graham red squirrels have to know how to tear into a pine cone to get the seeds out. If we only give them seeds, they may not know how to do that once they're released to the wild.
So we're gonna give the squirrels their diet right now. We feed them randomly 1, 2, or 3 times a day. Hide it throughout their enclosure. So we're just trying to simulate some natural foraging habits so they're not just getting all their food in a bowl.
It's also important that the animals don't get used to humans, which is why the researchers weigh them without handling them.
We have a balance between doing applied studies, applied research here, and not changing the animal's behavior, and applying what we learn towards improving the product, which is animals that have a better chance of surviving once we release them.
Meanwhile, the Phoenix Zoo is learning a lot about imperiled species.
When we have animals in this setting in hand, we're able to see them doing things that you can't really observe in the field.
It's sharing that information with other institutions that are developing breeding programs of their own, and with field biologists who conserve and manage endangered species.
it's really fantastic that we have such a great relationship with, other agencies like Game and Fish that many places don't have. And actually being able to work with animals nobody's ever worked with before, and gathering all this information for publications for future generations, and physically putting animals back on the ground and then monitoring their success. So yeah, it's I find it extremely gratifying to be involved in these kind of programs.
Much is still not known about the long-term success of these sorts of wildlife recovery efforts, but so far the Phoenix Zoo's Conservation and Science Center seems to be headed in the right direction.
So we know that a breeding program for release can ultimately result in an animal being stable in the wild. We've done it with orcs, we've done it with ferrets. We feel like it's happening pretty well with Chiricahua leopard frogs, and we're pretty confident that we have the insight and the tools to do it with the Montgomery red squirrel as well.
It's a side of the zoo most visitors never see. This commitment to conservation, working hard to keep wild animals in the wild, so the day never comes when a zoo is the only place to see them.
Well, that's our show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. For more information, go to our website at azgfd.gov. For all the fine folks at Arizona Game and Fish, I'm Jim Paxson. We'll see you next time.